Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, to our men's group and our study in the theology of Jurgen Moltmann. In his latest book, The Living God, which is published by John Knox Press, and we have been taking up a German perspective, a German point of view, and proceeding through the Christian theological concept of Aufgehoben. We have looked at the negation of diminished life. We have looked at the affirmation of faith as the step of preservation. And as of last lesson, Jurgen Moltmann has been addressing transcendence, and he's setting it up as a dichotomy. He's letting us take a look at false metaphysics and attributes and authentic metaphysics and attributes, the difference between the metaphysic of substance and the metaphysic of subject. And he identifies the metaphysic of subject with the Hebrew faith. And we're going to continue on with that lesson in the corrective teaching on transcendence. That's basically what we're looking at now, corrective teaching, the realignment of attributes concerning God, theology proper. And we've discussed 3 in the last lesson. We're going to pick up 3 more attributes this time. We've got the content of the attributes on the left, and then we're going to get out of the negative, and on the right side we have a summary, positive expression of what Moltmann presents. So take a look at the left triad. We'll start there. With block 1, we're going to look at false transcendence and the attribute of omnipresence. The classic definition is that God is all-present. The corrected definition by Moltmann is that we should say God surrounds us in a broad place, according to Psalm 31:8, so we can move freely in every direction. Omnipresence cannot be an attribute of a divine substance. Omnipresence can only be an attribute of a divine subject. It necessarily requires a metaphysic of subject. Now, of the necessary presuppositions, Moltmann says in note 4, the agony of the Gethsemane prayer. The agony prayer will endure until the end of the world. The hostile powers will be destroyed by the omnipresence of Jesus Christ. And he tells us why in note 6 with the next presupposition, because Christ suffered separation from God and abandonment by the Father on the cross, there is no longer any hell in which God is not present. Christ suffered the abandonment of God, the abandonment of the dark night of the soul, and therefore, because the resurrection has eschatologically qualified that suffering, there is no longer any hell in which God is not present. Now note 7, in the resurrected Christ, all godless powers have lost their power. Now Moltmann doesn't take away this attribute. He just says omnipresence can still be used, but as a surrounding broad freedom of time and space. It's that refuge of transcendent freedom that is available to us. It's that referential refuge, our saving moment within finitude of the presence of God's kingdom, which is always present in finitude to those who see with spiritual seeing and hear with spiritual hearing. Our second block, we're going to take a look at false transcendence and the attribute of omniscience. The classic definition, of course, is God is all-knowing, but Moltmann tells us that omniscience is always linked with God's providence, which can never be predetermination. In the act of creation, God concedes to humanity their own space, their own time. Therefore, of necessity, we must introduce the concept of divine self-limitation. And when this book was written in 2014, Moltmann actually had just published an essay concerning this exact same proposed truth, the self-limitation of God in the act of creation. It was his essay on passibility. But we must introduce the concept of divine self-limitation. Now, note 5, because providence and omniscience are reciprocal, self-limitation also applies to omniscience. Here's the corrective statement by Moltmann in Note 6. God does not know everything in advance because he has no desire to do so. And then Note 7, omniscience should be replaced with the concept of the gracious remembrance of the living God. For Moltmann, it should be transformed or represented as the gracious remembrance of the living God. God's providence is always directed toward future possibilities, and the corresponding subjective side of providential provision is the self's transcendent power of imagination in response. Transcendence equals the anticipation of possibility that we can perceive through spiritual seeing, hupakuo, seeing, and spiritual hearing. And then, therefore, in Note 8, therefore, providence equals God's promise, omniscience equals gracious remembrance, provision equals created tendential possibilities, and freedom equals time and space for response from humanity. So it is very much a relational qualification of the concept of omniscience, and it is taken up into that further attribute of this divine self-limitation. Now in Block 3 we move on to not another attribute, but we get to look at the false transcendence and the prohibition of images. That's a key factor to address when discussing the attributes of God. In Exodus 24 through 6, we are given the record of this prohibition. And why images can become destructive, Moltmann says, they cannot be possessed, they have their own rule in the imagination. They reflect preconceived ideas which become fixed. They tie the imaged person to a static past moment, and they negate the freedom of love that practices mutual transformations that keep the future open. So basically, fixed imaging freezes the future possibilities. But here's the key, Note 3. This is why we address this now in discussing the attributes of God. From images to conceptual attributes. We cannot make any conceptual image of the living God without misrepresenting God's living presence. We cannot make any conceptual image. God is beyond concept. God is so close that we cannot find any detachment from God in a conceptual way. Now that is almost universally affirmed in the 21st century in the realm of theology and philosophy, that the divine is beyond concept. That's very much taken up today as almost an axiomatic self-derived truth. But it is key here when discussing theology proper. Now, Note 3c, only astonishment can grasp God, not pin down concepts. And then to close out, likewise, God is being, not this or that existence. He is never to be represented by a particularity of existence. He is being itself. Ego I me. In the Greek, it's ego I me. If you look at the Gospel of John and look at the number of instances that you see ego I me, it is profound. Jesus pronounces again and again and again his identity with the Father. I and the Father are one. Ego I me. I am the I am. Before Abraham was, I am. Jesus pronounces this to the chamber of Pharisees. He pronounces this to the chamber of priests. And of course, that caused a persecution by the Sanhedrin. But this reality is that God is being. And Jesus Christ, as full deity, is the ego I me. He is the I am also. He is the second member of the triune Godhead. He is full deity. He is the I am. We cannot pin down God with these conceptual attributes. So Moltmann says, yes, I am presenting these alternatives, but even my alternatives are inadequate. Even my alternatives, which are alternatives that emphasize the suffering of God as revealed in Jesus Christ, even though my attributes are in alignment with the suffering Christ that is most evidently a revealed passibility of God and a movement of God as being able to be moved toward compassion, even my attributes miss the mark. They miss the mark because God is beyond concept. Fixed concepts try to freeze God into a static conceptual language. It's impossible. So even Moltmann says that, yes, I am offering you a corrective of transcendence, but I'm also telling you my attributes are also inadequate. And what we've done, we've got kind of a new format. I like the way this format kind of emerged on its own, emerged through the Spirit. But after the negative corrective teaching by Moltmann, it's nice to close out with a positive summary statement of the lesson. And I'm starting to do that now. I began with the last lesson, but I like that idea, so I'm doing it again. The triad on the right is a summary, positive affirmation of the evoking, abiding, liberating God. A positive affirmation of the evoking, abiding, liberating God. We're going to move out of these critical corrective teachings, and we're going to move into the positive statement. So if you look at the triad on the right, block 1, God is the ever-present surrounding time and space of broad refuge and freedom for the believer. Because Christ suffered abandonment by the Father on the cross, there is no longer any dark night of the soul where Christ is not present. Christ is with us in every dark night of the soul. Every depth of suffering, every depth of questioning, why is this happening? Why am I suffering this? We are never abandoned. Christ is promised through the abandonment on the cross and the resurrection as the negation of that abandonment. We have the promise that Christ is with us in the dark night of the soul. Block 2, God is gracious remembrance and the creative power of possibility. He is promise. That falls way back to Moltmann's inaugural book, The Theology of Hope, in 1965 in German, 1967 in English. But that's profoundly a summary of that book. God is gracious remembrance and the creative power of possibility. God is promise. Providence and omniscience are reciprocal and both influenced by God's grace of self-limitation. And grace is a self-limitation in order that God could give us independence and freedom and time to respond to His possibilities. And then to close out, take a look at block 3. God is being. God is the I am. And beyond all conceptual attributes, God is grasped, according to Moltmann, in astonishment, the astonishment of transcendence. What can I say? Again, we find beautiful teaching in this third moment of Aufgehoben, this third moment of transcendence, which for Moltmann, because of our atheistic society and because of our contamination by the metaphysic of substance, he must necessarily address corrective transcendence before he can move on to positive transcendence. So we do have the corrective teaching on the left here, but we do have summary positive statements, and we most assuredly can join our fellow brother and teacher and prophet Jurgen Moltmann in affirming these great truths of promise in this triad on the right. It's very positive content for the attributes of God, but we need to remember that Jurgen Moltmann is telling us that even his corrective attributes within the metaphysic of subject, which is the Hebrew position and the early Hegelian position, prior to his taking on the position at the university at Jena. It looks like it's Jena in English, but it's pronounced Jena. I mispronounced that last time, but prior to his position at the University of Jena, Hegel was a theology student, and he did receive his certificate of theological studies, and his concept of Aufgehoben was posited in his work as a Christian theological concept, and every German who is an authentic theologian that relies in any way whatsoever on Hegel is going to take up that concept of Aufgehoben and move through negation, preservation, and transcendence. Negation, preservation, and transcendence. But the one individual who has done that the most profoundly over the last 40 years or 50 years is the prophetic voice of Jurgen Moltmann. It all began in 1965 with the German version of the Theology of Hope. It reached us in America in 1967, and then he followed that up with the Crucified God because Americans misinterpreted that book and started creating a false utopia. Moltmann had to correct that with his Crucified God in 1973, which said that resurrection has a horizon, a directive content, which is given to us in the crucifixion. Resurrection is a new exodus, which is guided by the horizon defined in the crucifixion. It's the negation of abandonment. It's the negation of the dark night of the soul. It's taking up our position with the oppressed. It's taking up our position with the weak. It's taking up our position with those who are downtrodden and offering hope to a hopeless world and a living God to an atheistic culture. Again, a profound, blessed teaching by Jurgen Moltmann. And next time we'll pick up at page 57, it looks like.